Diminizide, which has been sprayed on apples for more than 20 years, breaks down into another chemical called UDMH.
The EPA's acting administrator, Dr. Jack Moore, acknowledged that the EPA has known about the cancer risk for 16 years.
There's no question if it was a new chemical, not yet on the market, and it was brought to the agency to be evaluated, that it would not get on the market based on the data that was available.
Well, Dr. Moore, I don't understand that. I mean, you telling me something that if this stuff came to you today and it was brand new, it wouldn't get on the market. But because it's already out there, we can keep using it. That doesn't make sense to me.
You've just identified one of the paradoxes of the statute. Once a pesticide gets its license, gets its registration, is on the market, despite what everybody might think, the burden of carrying unreasonable risk finding basically goes on to the government. All right?
But you see, a lot of these chemicals got on the market when we didn't know that they were cancer-causing agents, and they're on the market now, and we know that they do cause cancer.
You're correct.
But you're saying we can't take them off because they're already on the market, and they went on the market, and we didn't know they cause cancer.
That's the paradox of the statute.
It's crazy.
We ought to change the statute.
Is it fair to say then, Dr. Moore, that there are laws on the books that are putting all of us, particularly our children, at risk?
Could be. Could be.
While Dr. Moore blames a law which requires him to balance the health risk to the public against the economic benefits to the growers, Congressman Jerry Sikorsky blames the EPA.
They have two laws. One is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that says quite clearly if this chemical causes tumor in laboratory animals, not malignant tumors, any kind of tumors, it's supposed to be pulled off the market.
Jack Moore, the deputy administrator of the EPA, says that he'd like to take it off the market, but he's afraid that the manufacturer, Uniroyal, that makes this chemical, could successfully sue the EPA if he did so.
So let them sue. That's his job. He's with the Environmental Protection Agency. Go to a cancer ward at any children's hospital in this country. See these bald, wasting away kids, and then make a decision as to whether the risks balance over the benefits.
Kids are at a high risk from UDMH because they drink so much apple juice. The average preschooler drinks 18 times more apple juice than his or her mother. If those apples were treated with Diminizide, the cancer risk is perilously high. Janet Hathaway is a senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council.
What we're talking about is a cancer-causing agent used on food that EPA knows is going to cause cancer for thousands of children over their lifetime.
Uniroyal Chemical, which makes Diminizide under the trade name Alar, declined to be interviewed for this report. But in a letter, they said any risk from Diminizide or UDMH, if it exists, is negligible. Nonetheless, preliminary results from Uniroyal's own study already show high levels of cancer in laboratory animals. Janet Hathaway's organization, the Natural Resources Defense Council, has just completed the most careful study yet on the effect of Diminizide and 7 other cancer-causing pesticides in the food children eat.
Just from these 8 pesticides, what we're finding is that the risk of developing cancer is approximately 250 times what EPA says is an acceptable level of cancer in our population.
250 times?
That's right. What that means is that over a lifetime, 1 child out of every 4,000 or so of our preschoolers will develop cancer just from these 8 pesticides.
And the EPA says acceptable limit is 1 out of?
1 out of 1,000,000 they say is acceptable.
Are they scaring people needlessly? Are they fear-mongers?
Well, there's no question that if the risk is greater than the 1 in a million calculation, it's of cause for concern to this agency.
Now, you've had a chance to look at the NRDC study. It says children are being exposed to a pesticide risk several hundred times greater than what the agency says is acceptable.
Risk unacceptable? Yes. Magnitude of risk is less by our calculation than apparently they calculate.
Dr. John Grafe, a professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School, also reviewed the study by the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Well, I think that by and large, the basis of the report is sound. I think the principles it's based on are very sound, which is that children clearly are subject to very large exposures to these chemicals, that they are at significant risk that they are at greater risk than our adults. I may quibble a little bit with the calculations, but that quibbling doesn't get away from the basic point that the FDA regulations, or the FDA surveillance, and the EPA regulations are not addressing the danger to children.
The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is supposed to monitor pesticide residues in our food, including residues of the apple spray UDMH.
Do you have any idea on which vegetables, which products, which fruits have been tested in the last couple of years for UDMH?
Well, we have that data. I don't have it all on my fingertips.
2 jars of grape jelly, 1 piece of cherry candy. That's not very reassuring.
Well, the data speak for themselves. Ed, there's no question that the level of resource that's available to FDA does not allow one to have a meaningful presence every day on every commodity.
Some of the danger from pesticides comes from growers outside the U.S. who ignore pesticide laws altogether. Here's one in Mexico who was caught spraying toxic chemicals on his own workers. Bad for the workers and hardly reassuring for us, considering that most of our winter vegetables come from Mexico. And what kind of job is the Food and Drug Administration doing to ensure that pesticide-contaminated food doesn't reach us? We went to the border checkpoint in Laredo, Texas with Congressman Sikorsky.
What's the likelihood that if one of those loads contains pesticides that are actually banned in the United States, that the FDA is going to catch it right here at the border?
Almost nil. Nothing. Zip.
Congressman Sikorsky's committee held hearings on how the FDA monitors pesticide residues.
If they do flag someone and decide that they want to make a test, how long does it take to find out if there's a problem?
The average in our hearing in '87, we found out, was 28 days.
28 days?
28 days. Now it's down to maybe 2 to 3 weeks. And by then, this fresh produce is likely to have been already stocked and consumed.
We looked for the food and drug inspector at this border crossing, but he was nowhere in sight. That's not surprising. One FDA agent is supposed to monitor 4 separate border crossings spread over 400 miles. And if that's not bad enough, the FDA's routine tests for pesticide residues don't even pick up half of the most dangerous ones. One of the cancer-causing pesticides the FDA's routine test doesn't pick up at all is Benamil.
Of the 50 or 60 billion pounds of bananas that came into the United States over an 8-year period, do you know how many bananas the FDA sampled for the carcinogenic pesticide that's known as Benamil?
Not specifically, but having sat through a Senate testimony earlier in the year, I think the answer might be 1.
2.
2.
Right. Not 2 boatloads, 2 truckloads, 2 bunches, 2 bananas. Are you comfortable with that?
I would certainly like to see greater sampling for Benamil in this case.
Like Benamil on bananas, dimenizide on apples can't be washed or peeled off. When apples are processed, say for apple juice or applesauce, dimenizide quickly turns into UDMH, a more dangerous chemical which, believe it or not, is also rocket fuel. Just 2 weeks after we first interviewed him, the EPA's Dr. Moore took another look at the evidence and decided to start the process of banning dimenizide after all. But that process could take 5 years. So we returned to Washington to ask him why he doesn't just declare dimenizide an imminent hazard and suspend it right away, which the law does allow him to do. If the risk is unacceptable by your own admission, you have the authority under the law today to make it and declare it an imminent hazard and get rid of it.
In rare instances, you might have a risk that is so provocative that you do not want to allow this chemical to stay in use during the period of the cancellation process. They then allow for suspension action. In our opinion, the data that we have in hand is not sufficiently provocative to allow us to make that suspension finding.
I'm not a scientist, but if you're telling me that this stuff is 50 times more dangerous, the levels are 50 times higher than what you say is acceptable, that says to me that's a problem, Dr. Moore. That says to me that if we are protecting the environment, protecting us, you take it off.
Ed, we aren't debating whether or not there's a problem here. What we're debating is the pace by which one should get it off the market. We have concluded that it's a problem. It should come off the market. We think under the existing law, the avenue that's available to us is through a normal cancellation as opposed to an accelerated suspension.
If EPA doesn't think that the most potent cancer-causing chemical in our food supply is grounds enough to declare an imminent hazard and remove it from food, well, I don't know what kind of risk it takes then to declare a chemical an imminent hazard.
From the time the first red flag went up, it will have taken 19 years to get this stuff off the market, out of the food supply.
That's correct, based on the original studies back in the 70s.
They have the opportunity to suspend the use of the chemical today if they want to do it, and they're not doing it. Instead, they're telling us that maybe over a few years, they'll slowly ease this out of the food supply.
How much diminizide is still in the food supply? The last time the government checked, in 1986, it was in 80% of processed apple products. Since then, most food processors say they no longer use apples treated with diminizide. Well, this week, we spoke to Consumers Union, which publishes Consumer Reports magazine. They had a laboratory analyze 32 samples of apple juice that were on the market last year. Consumers Union scientist Dr. Ned Groth says there is less diminizide than there was 3 years ago, but there's still plenty out there.
Out of 32 samples we analyzed, 5 had significantly higher levels of diminizide than you would have thought, and 2/3 of them had some diminizide. Only 9 out of 32 had no detectable diminizide.
Did you find diminizide in any of the products whose manufacturers claim they no longer use diminizide-treated apples?
Yes, all of the products that we found diminizide in were from manufacturers who had made that statement to us previously, that they don't use diminizide-treated apples.
So after they told you you don't use it, you studied their products?
What our tests show is that manufacturers who have made that promise are not succeeding at keeping diminizide out of their products. Not all manufacturers, but some are not succeeding.
So when a parent goes to the grocery store looking for an apple product that does not contain diminizide, how do you do that?
It's supermarket roulette. You don't know. The consumer can't tell by looking at the bottle whether it's got diminizide in it or not. And unfortunately, the consumer can't tell by depending on the manufacturer's assurance that they're using diminizide-free apples, because we've shown that that isn't valid in all cases.